We've just been notified that the Governor State Bank is en route, so we'll just wait for him to begin the session, formally begin the session. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum and good morning. I was trifle nervous when coming on the rostrum because this topic is complex, complicated, technical. And then I had a look at all the work, the lovely work that InfraCo does. And I felt all my prep and all my rehearsal might just go down the drain because there's so much more that I still don't know. But yes, this is some absolutely wonderful work going on. Welcome to the Infrastructure Summit 2023, Building for Impact, in partnership with the Nutshell Group, in partnership with the International Finance Corporation World Bank Group, UK Aid, InfraCo Asia, PIDG, Infrastructure Changing Lives, and GuarantCo with Guarantees for Development. We begin with the name of Allah Ta'ala.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد.
Ameen. If I could request everyone to please rise for the national anthem of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Few things to note. We have a survey form on the table, and I would request all the guests to please fill it out. The volunteers on the floor will also be reaching out to you for the same. We also have a couple of hashtags, so any sharing of information on social media must carry the hashtags of Infrastructure Summit 2023 and Building for Impact. If I could request our illustrious panel for the inaugural session to please join us on stage before we begin the introduction. I would request Mohammad Asfar Ehsan, founder Nutshell Group and former Minister of State and Chairman Board of Investment. Maheen Rahman, Chief Executive Officer, InfraCo. Laith Al-Falaki, Chief Executive Officer, GuarantCo. Jo Moa, Development Director, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And our chief guest, Mr. Jameel Ahmed, Governor State Bank of Pakistan. I think claps would do well. They would sort of charge up the morning. I know we are still being joined by people. On behalf of InfraCo and Nutshell Group today, we welcome you to the very first summit on Building for Impact. Polycrisis, essential SDGs, inflations, layoff, outbreak, the trending hashtags seem more like a script of a science fiction movie where stress and chaos rule the day, and where landing Martians become nothing more than just one more challenge to handle. I think we all understand the economic challenges that Pakistan and the globe face today. It is not the first time, and neither will it be the last. Keynes economics has taught us that the highs and lows of a cycle will continue, and common sense decrees that various interventions can always help to balance and stabilize. The question is the how of putting those ideas into implementation. Keynes, again observing the 30s depression, advocated deficit spending on labor-intensive infrastructure projects to stimulate employment and stabilize wages during economic downturns. If we go into Islamic history, we see zakat being introduced to enable financing, the groundwork required for the immigrants to finance their new businesses alongside the partnership models. So scaffolding happening here. I wouldn't be far from the truth if I say that InfraZamin is a code for this thought-backed, deliberated support for the projects that need to see the light of the day, to play their active and integral role in the developing economy. The general state of degradation and destruction that Pakistan has seen in the recent floods pointed very clearly towards one startling fact, that the devastation primarily happened not of the infrastructure, but for the lack of it. The scaffolding that infrastructure provides is the zamin, or the guarantor of productivity against possible challenges. And that may just be the mission and vision statement of InfraZamin Pakistan. Pakistan has been a developing economy for the longest time with a dire need of stabilizing infrastructure, be it the industry of energy, power, music, be it health or education, be it logistical or financial. Each one of them needs a friend who can be their channel for financial planning and collaboration, to stand as a witness to their potential, and this is where the team of InfraZamin comes in. Half of the questions have been answered in the title of the summit already, Building for Impact. It is not just about making it happen, but making it happen for the lasting benefit of society, in sync with the mission statements of their partners, PIDG, GuarantCo, IFC, UK Aid, InfraCo Asia, and continuous work with Karandas. And of course, they're being here today to open the agenda amongst stakeholders, collaborative partners, potential partners, and of course, friends to explore more opportunities to make this developing economy of Pakistan take a strong step towards becoming a developed one. To formally welcome all the guests and friends, I invite Mohammad Asfar Ehsan, former Minister of State, Chairman Board of Investment, founder Corporate Pakistan Group, founder and CEO of Nutshell Group, comprising of Nutshell Conferences, Nutshell Communications, Nutshell Consulting, President of the Marketing Association of Pakistan. Asfar is also actively engaged with the governments of Saudi Arabia and Uzbekistan for the facilitation of investors and joint ventures. Mohammad Asfar Ehsan, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Shah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. On behalf of InfraZamin and Nutshell Group, I'm very grateful to all of you for your presence here at the first edition of Infrastructure Summit. The theme of this summit is Building for Impact. I'm personally grateful for the presence of Governor State Bank, Mr. Jameel Ahmed, our distinguished speakers from outside Pakistan, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, and all other speakers and panelists of today's conference. This is actually an initiative of InfraZamin. As all of you are aware, they are doing commendable work in Pakistan, and there is a huge potential of their work and attracting investment from outside Pakistan. I want to say only 2 or 3 points. That for infrastructure, for FDI, and for sustainable investment, we need 2 or 3 things in this country. One is the political stability. This is most important. Whatever we are facing today is because of political stability, not only the economic crisis. So there is a need of collaboration amongst all stakeholders, including the political parties, including the business community, regulators, and all the other concerned stakeholders. This is the need of the hour. And without creating and without any sustainable political stability, we will face these issues again and again. There is a huge potential of investments in every industry. FDI is the second thing, but the first thing is to facilitate the existing investors in Pakistan, whether they are local investors or whether they are the foreign investors. When I worked with the Board of Investment, our 80% focus was on the creating the enabling environment for the local investors. Because what we are facing today, that many manufacturing industries are in crisis. Few of the mobile manufacturing companies are right now not working. One example is the Techno, the manufacturers of Nokia in Pakistan. Yesterday we saw the ad of Pharma Bureau. Asif Jumma is here, he headed Pharma Bureau and OICCI. And the PPM, a Pakistan Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association. The pharma industry is in crisis because we are not facilitating them. So there is a need of hand-holding of all these investors. There is a need of facilitation of specific issues, the problems they are facing today. What I observed in last, especially 1 decade, and all of you are aware that in the governments, there is no long-term strategy. We always work on ad hoc basis. And this is the dilemma. Without a sustainable and long-term strategy, we can't achieve results. So whatever we are facing, it's up to us how we will collaborate and how we will address these issues. InfraZamin is doing commendable work, and this is directly linked with the political stability in the country. This is directly linked with the investment climate in this country. And I appreciate the efforts of the leader of InfraZamin, Mahin Rahman, and her very able team actually. And when she talked to us to collaborate with this conference, we decided to collaborate with them because this topic is very important, this area is very important. This is just the beginning. And we decided to host this summit and the dialogues, the series of dialogues, not only the KLI, but all small cities also, like Faisalabad, like Sialkot, like Multan, Hyderabad, Peshawar, because there is a need of create awareness also. So with this note, I want to thank all of you again for your presence, and I hope that you will enjoy the discussions here. And I'm again grateful to Governor State Bank, Mr. Jameel Ahmed, for his presence. Thank you everyone.
Thank you, Asfar. Yes, commendable work by InfraZamin. The more I read, the more I researched, I realized what a beauty I was missing. FDI, very important, but then for FDI, sustainable framework of policies, which is long-term, as Asfar said. I so agree, and I'm sure everybody in the hall does too. We go on to our next speaker. The world has now redefined the leader. The leader is now empathetic, friend, supporter, and visionary. Rising above any gender difference or geography, the new CEO is neither isolated nor unknown to his team. The CEO is the person who now realizes the potential of the team member with the right placement and conducive ecosystem delivers a great top line with a glorifying purpose. Mahin Rahman was appointed the Chief Executive Officer of InfraZamin Pakistan in 2020, and since then she has played a crucial part in setting up InfraZamin Pakistan's base operations and its initial structure. Her resume is a winner's chronicle, with turnarounds and profits flanking her achievements. Whether it was the GHP investment funds or IGI funds, she made it all shine. with 2 decades plus experience in the financial industry, Maheen holds her own with a definite command over the best routes forward. She has been featured in Fortune's 40 Under 40 Women to Watch list in 2015. I now invite the CEO, InfraZamin, Maheen Rahman, to take the mic and enable all of us a deeper dive into the wonderful opportunities that Infrastructure Summit 2023 proposes.
Glowing introduction. Ji, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's indeed an absolute pleasure to be here and to hold this conference, which has been many months in the making. I'd really like to thank the Governor, Central Bank, for being here today. We really value your presence. Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, your assistance has been invaluable, and so has your leadership. Mr. Akif Said, Chairman, SCCP, is also here. Thank you for your presence, and esteemed guests. It really is my honor to welcome you here. Now we talk about infrastructure at perhaps what may seem an odd time. Pakistan's debt issues are looming. The IMF deal is elusive. And so perhaps we are at a crossroads in our country. And we really need to wonder, is infrastructure spending what we need to be thinking about, or are there more immediate concerns? In fact, I would say now in this crisis is probably the time to begin talking about the issues that have plagued us in the past in Pakistan. And infrastructure has been, I would say, at the heart of it. As a country of 220 million people, we need to be spending 10% of our GDP, or $35 billion a year annually, in developing our infrastructure for our growing population, for our young population. And what all is that infrastructure? It's not just roads and buildings. It's health facilities, it's education facilities, it's water sanitation. For our agriculture, it's related to irrigation. We have seen the devastation that our floods have caused. And honestly, this was a preventable situation if we had just invested in our agricultural irrigation infrastructure better. Our neighbors, which is India and Bangladesh, and we often compare ourselves to them. The reality is that they have moved ahead in the GDP per capita game simply through their own investments in renewable energy, in irrigation systems, in agricultural research, and in developing health systems and education systems, which are now bearing fruit. So how do we address this issue? And here, let me talk a little bit about the Private Infrastructure Development Group, which is the parent company of InfraZamin. What does the PIDG do? This is not an aid organization or an NGO. What this company does is it has been set up for a very unique purpose, and it is sovereign-backed. So it is backed by 6 European governments, including the United Kingdom, Australia, Sweden, Denmark, as well as the Netherlands, to take a look at how infrastructure spending can be better managed using local markets. So using local currency financing, or PKR-based financing. We have seen situations in Pakistan. You can see what the currency has, everybody is very familiar with where the current rupee rate is relative to the dollar. And under these circumstances, it is very difficult to raise dollar-based financing for Pakistan, or even to service that dollar-based financing for the country. So we need to be able to use our local banks and our local capital markets, develop our bond markets more significantly, so that this financing can actually happen in Pakistan currency, as opposed to foreign currency, which is what we have been doing for the last 20, 30 odd years. So let's talk about what PIDG has accomplished elsewhere, and why in specific are they so keen to explore opportunities in Pakistan. How have they mobilized local currency financing? I'll pick up an example in India. Recently, GuarantCo, whose CEO is here on the stage with you today, and he'll talk a bit more about this. Recently, GuarantCo signed a $200 million guarantee with Axis Bank in India to roll out electronic vehicle financing. Now we have a problem as far as our current account goes, is the second oil prices go up. Our energy requirements are 70% of our import bill, and we are immediately vulnerable to currency depreciation. We need to start looking at e-mobility options today, and I'm very happy to note that there are quite a few banks who are looking at this now. What GuarantCo did was effectively provide a guarantee against all EV charging stations, infrastructure development, and vehicles to build out the ecosystem in India for EVs. And that will, in the future, save India tremendous amounts in fuel costs and petrol costs going forward as well. The other thing that they've done, and this is in Nigeria actually, is a $150 million bond, all raised by local investors towards funding an economic zone. Now, Pakistan's had a rough history with economic zones. We do build them, we like to create them, we like to make them tax-free, but the reality is they never manage to get off the ground. And we are left with heavy debt burdens from foreign companies wishing to use those economic zones. This bond in Nigeria will effectively transfer that debt towards the local currency market, thereby making it incredibly viable to service that debt long-term in the future as well. So you see, with these small interventions, it is all about providing the private sector comfort, last mile financing, whether it comes in the form of debt, or it comes in the form of equity, or it comes in the form of guarantee frameworks, all of which are used to crowd in the private sector, as opposed to what we have running in Pakistan today, which is crowding out the private sector. So these frameworks are very important for developing the local financing market towards large-scale infrastructure projects, and that's what we're going to explore later here today. I'll talk a little bit about InfraZamin. We've been about a year in the market here, but we've already managed to close one transaction. I think Multinet is also here with us today. So what was the Multinet transaction and what made it so special? Effectively, this was pure credit risk mitigation. And this is what we talk about when we talk about providing comfort to the markets or comfort to the banking sector. So the Multinet expansion, which had been on the cards for about a couple of years, ran into trouble because the total financing amount was not available to the company. And this is where we step in and we talk to private sector companies and we see how can we help you. Multinet approached us as, is there something we can do? We said yes. We sat down with their primary bank, which was HBL, and we said, why don't we give a guarantee to HBL Bank against this expansion project that Multinet wishes to do. So not only was HBL receptive, we managed to close the entire financing. They raised 2.1 billion rupees from HBL. And today, Multinet is now laying one of the largest fiber optic networks on a certain technology, which is available in specific areas. And they're doing a 14,000 kilometer fiber optic expansion, which will cover 120 cities in Pakistan. So that is the impact that we can have in terms of digital access, to not just the main cities of Pakistan, but also to Tier 2, Tier 3, and to the SME and commercial sector as well. So these are sort of the broad areas of intervention that both the private infrastructure development group as well as InfraZamin is hoping to have. And this stems across all areas, whether it is looking at the logistics sector, looking at the agricultural sector, looking at the social development sector, which is one of the transactions that we're now working on for the future as well. So to summarize, it is now going to be a lot more going forward. As we see in the world, the way the geopolitics are moving, the use of aid is fading for Pakistan. The world has run out of patience with regards to constant aid programs. So more and more it's about what projects do you have, Are they commercially viable? Can they be made commercially viable? And can we raise that financing locally? Because it's only through those changes in the way that we actually do infrastructure financing and build what is needed for ourselves by ourselves that I think we will be able to slowly move out of the issues that we're facing today. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today, and I hope we all learn a lot more from this session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maheen. Debt issues looming, IMF deal is elusive, and then, of course, how SEZs haven't really taken off. What do we need to do? Pakistan has the potential, and as somebody said, when we say potential, it's a sad word. It means nothing has been done as yet. So the potential is there, and it is the time to do it. As Maheen put it, the donors have run out of patience. The aid has collapsed. We have the raw materials, we have the scope, we have competency, we have people who have the ability and capacity to deliver. So let them shine, and I think that's where infrastructure would comes in really, really hard, because they have the facility to deliberate, to ponder over, to come up with the right plan to go forward. And as I said in the introduction also, Pakistan suffered, and Maheen repeated it, not on the infrastructure, it suffered for the lack of the infrastructure. Had infrastructure been there, the suffering could have been minimized. We move on to our next speaker. GuarantCo's local currency credit solutions unlock the potential of local capital markets and help close the infrastructure funding gap in lower income countries. I'm kind of recapping what Maheen you said. I was reading about Madagascar. So GuarantCo and AGF provide green yellow, which is a solar panel facility, with 7.1 million credit guarantee in euros to finance a 20 megawatt solar plant extension with a 5 megawatt solar battery storage system. The project of solar plant extension will provide improved electricity access to around 285,000 people, supporting SDG 7, and reduce emissions by 28,000 tons of carbon dioxide through the displacement of thermal power, supporting SDG 13. So you see how beautifully the entire sustainable development goals are intertwined in whatever is being done. With many such success stories across Africa and Asia, GuarantCo is strengthening the sustainable footprint of infrastructure with developing economies. To further explore this, we invite Laith Al-Falaki, Chief Executive Officer, GuarantCo. Laith has been the Chief Risk Officer at PIDG since April 2018. He's currently also a non-executive member of the boards of PIDG companies, the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund, and GuarantCo. Before joining PIDG, Laith was CRO at ICICI Bank, UK, the European hub of India's largest private sector bank, where his responsibilities included credit, operational market, and liquidity risk, as well as regulatory frameworks. Before this, he was the CRO at the British Arab Commercial Bank, formerly part of the HSBC Group. Laith has had a long career in banking and has in-depth experience dealing in emerging markets. His experience includes trade services, operations, audit, marketing, correspondent banking, and compliance. His appointment as the CEO of GuarantCo has been commended for the continuation of leveraging the multiple product propositions that the various PIDG companies can offer to deliver a significant impact to support sustainable, essential infrastructure financing in lower income countries across Africa and Asia. CEO GuarantCo, Laith Al-Falaki. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much for those very kind words. Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I think I've already been introduced, and we've talked a bit about what PIDG does, the Private Infrastructure Development Group, and what GuarantCo does. But at the heart of that is a mission. and that mission is to help alleviate poverty in the world's poorest and most fragile countries through the provision of infrastructure. Now that sounds a very grandiose aim, and you may say, how can PIDG do that on its own? Especially when you look at the infrastructure funding gap across Asia and Africa. I think some estimates say it's going to be 15 trillion by 2040. In fact, just basic infrastructure spending across the globe has to increase by 1 trillion each year from now till 2040 to meet the basic needs of the population. How can we as GuarantCo, as PIDG, as InfraZamin address that when the numbers that we talk about are so small? We talked about a project there in Madagascar. And the answer to that is really that we can't do it on our own. If you take the World Bank, if you take all the MDBs, if you take the DFIs, we can't come close to that number. Sorry. The only way we can come close is by mobilizing the private sector and mobilizing institutional money into the investment of infrastructure. And that is a key part of what we do. We, as PIDG, have a portfolio of, say, about 2.5 billion, but we've helped mobilize about 40 billion of spending into infrastructure. And that's the role we want to play. We want to play that catalytic role where we ensure that institutional money and private money flows into Pakistan and the other markets in which we are present. So how do we do this? Well, we do it not just through guarantees. I am the CEO of the guarantee arm of PIDG, but we also do it through early stage equity. It's very important that we have bankable projects. And that is what our two sister companies, InfraCo Asia and InfraCo Africa, do. They provide early stage equity, make the projects bankable, and then they exit. Now, at exit, quite often, they haven't got sufficient investment partners, so they can also take an equity stake there. The next stage is to then move on to long-term financing, and we find that actually that's a big problem. Actually, we may be able to get financing into infrastructure, but can we get long-term financing? Infrastructure financing typically requires 15, 20-year time horizons. Banks generally are unwilling to lend beyond, say, 5 or 7 years. So how do we bridge that gap? That is something that we do through either long-term financing or the products that GuarantCo provides as a contingent credit provider in these markets with its product called the Liquidity Extension Guarantee, where we effectively provide banks with a put option allowing them to lend for 15, 20 years and have a put option on GuarantCo after just 7. Around all this, we have a technical assistance facility, and that provides both upstream and downstream technical assistance. Upstream, working with governments on PPAs, PPPs, regulatory guidance, etc., to make the environment conducive for infrastructure investment. We also provide a downstream technical assistance, providing embedded advisors and capacity building for the projects in which we invest. And that's very important to us because capacity building is actually harnessing the talent and the power of a country rather than bringing in external consultants. So people will say, well, that's all well and good, but look what is facing Pakistan today. We heard of some of the challenges that Maheen talked about. Are these not markets where we would generally retrench from? I would say exactly the opposite. this is the time we need to double down in these countries because the need is greater than ever. We should not be a fair weather friend. We should be a friend in need. When infrastructure spending is required, we've seen the devastating floods that took place last year. We really need to set out our stall to crowd in private sector investment into climate resilient infrastructure. That's absolutely essential. You know, I know we don't operate in a vacuum. I know that there are, debt crises all over the place. There's the aftermath of COVID, there's supply chain issues, high inflation, energy security, food security issues. And that has meant a lot of governments are really struggling. And if you look what we've done in Africa, we've really come to the fore in those markets. Even last year, there were 20 countries in Africa that are at high risk, according to the IMF, of debt distress. 20 out of 54 countries in Africa. One of those is Cameroon. Yet last year, we invested in road infrastructure, toll plaza infrastructure into a project in Cameroon. We provided a partial credit guarantee, which is our bread and butter, but we also provided the liquidity extension guarantee that I talked about for that infrastructure project, and we got it off the ground. And I'm very pleased to say, just last week, we won the IJ Global Best Transport Deal in Africa award for that piece of infrastructure in one of the most difficult countries in Africa. Kenya is another country that is now in high risk of debt distress. We have offices in Kenya. We're growing our team in Kenya. This is our commitment to these difficult countries. And we're not just growing our team, but we're doing infrastructure investment on the ground. We recently did a student housing project in Nairobi. We're now looking at extending that, and that was via a green bond, mobilizing the capital markets. We're now looking at doing affordable housing. And when we talk about infrastructure, we mustn't forget, as well as roads and power and water, actually social infrastructure is absolutely key. We really need to make sure that people have a roof over their heads and not just cannot just turn the power on. So we're doing that in Kenya. We're also working on the more traditional infrastructure in Kenya, 2 landmark road projects which we are working on this year despite the economic headwinds. So that brings me to Pakistan and what we have done here so far. I think we've done some 8 projects already as the Private Infrastructure Development Group in Pakistan. Our sister company, InfraCo Asia, has done 3 renewable power projects right across the renewable sector. So it's done hydro, it's done wind, it's done solar. At GuarantCo, we've also been involved in some of that climate and renewable piece. We've recently closed a deal with Shams Power for 21.5 megawatts of rooftop solar and ground-mounted solar for CNI, which is important. We're also working on the transmission piece with K Electric, and I think that actually doesn't just talking about renewables, but actually climate resilience. In the monsoon, every year in Karachi, a significant number of people have died through illegal connections. What we have been doing with K Electric is actually rolling out ABC cables, aerial bundled cabling. And that is a 50 million commitment that we had provided, which on the back of that, this year, I'm pleased to say, during the monsoon, there were 0 deaths because of the rollout of that cabling. So that is really climate resilience in action. That brings me finally to our commitment to InfraZamin. I think it's very important for us to ensure that local currency financing and local institutional money is mobilized in country. And therefore, one of the key deliverables for PIDGE is the rollout of credit enhancement facilities on the ground locally in country. We've done that in Nigeria already through InfraCredit Nigeria, and as you heard Maheen say, that is already doing very large-scale projects. We've done it with InfraZamin here, and we're now looking to do it in East Africa and beyond. And the beauty of these type of institutions is that they benefit from a AAA rating locally, and they can crowd in both institutional money and local currency investment. So within InfraZamin, we've provided both equity through InfraCo Asia and also contingent capital through GuarantCo. And we certainly hope to partner with InfraZamin going forward on delivering the infrastructure that is needed in this country in local currency and mobilizing the capital markets and mobilizing institutional money. So we are here, just to reiterate, for the long term, working very closely with InfraZamin and also wherever we are needed elsewhere in Pakistan. You have my undertaking that we are there, and we will join that journey with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laith. Such encouraging words. When he said 40 billion US dollars being mobilized, and then he said that money can flow into Pakistan, I thought the chandeliers were brighter. And I think, just the concept, the beauty of whatever Laith was talking about, how these countries have really emerged in terms of infrastructure because of experts who can conceptualize and because of experts who can finance. I think there can be nothing more beautiful, especially where we are in Pakistan today. I would just like to give a clap to all the wonderful concepts being shared, and I hope that this comes to fruition, inshallah, very soon. So we were talking about long-term financing, we were talking about stressed countries, we were talking about green bonds, and that 8 projects have already been done. I'm going to list 4 tangents of work. Agriculture, improving crop and livestock production practices for higher food security and farmer income while reducing emissions. Forestry, second, protecting and re-establishing forests for their economic and ecosystem services, including as carbon stocks. 3, power, expanding electricity generation from renewable energy for domestic and regional markets. 4th, transport, industrial sectors and buildings, leapfrogging to modern and energy efficient technologies. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the 4 tangents that the Democratic Federal Republic of Ethiopia is working with for a green, sustainable economy, and it is one of the countries directly impacted by the work of our next guest speaker. The person that I'm inviting next is Joe Moa. Did I get your name right, Joe? Moir? Okay. Joe Moir, Development Director, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, British High Commission, Islamabad. Joe Moir has worked for His Majesty's government in a range of development and foreign affairs roles since 1999 and has been Deputy Head of Ethiopia since June 2016. She has led joint programs in Sudan, Libya, and Egypt, represented the UK and UN negotiations on peacekeeping and conflict prevention, helped to set up the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, and managed core UK investments into the UN and Red Cross movement for humanitarian crisis. Most recent roles include Deputy Head of DFID's Conflict and Humanitarian Department and setting up the new joint FCO DFID North Africa unit. Joe Moir, ladies and gentlemen.
Assalamu alaikum. It's really good to be with you all today. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to Maheen and the InfraZamin team for holding this really important infrastructure summit. I think it represents a really significant moment in the journey that you're making at InfraZamin to unlock financing opportunities for infrastructure here in Pakistan. And also huge thanks to the partners here today, to PIDGE, GuarantCo, InfraCo Asia, and GuarantCo, not to mention the State Bank of Pakistan and the Board of Investment. Without the support of these partners, we wouldn't be here today to celebrate this next step on InfraZamin's journey. So you might well ask, what are we doing here today as the British government? Why am I standing here? What's our interest? And basically, I'm coming from the point of view of the UK's long-standing development partnership here in Pakistan. Maheen talked about the aid flows that have come into Pakistan over the past couple of decades. And the UK, of course, has been quite a significant provider of aid here in Pakistan. But it's also right that aid flows have reduced. That's true in Pakistan, that's true around the world. And in some ways, we should be celebrating that, believe it or not. You know, Pakistan is not the same country that it was 20 years ago. It's now a middle-income country. There has been enormous progress against many of the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's been real growth here in terms of the markets. So that there are good reasons that aid has reduced. But I also want to talk today about the way that development finance can be used differently. So not just in terms of that perhaps slightly old-fashioned donor-recipient kind of relationship, but more in terms of a partnership between the UK government and the government of Pakistan and organisations here in Pakistan like InfraZamin that can really crowd in new investment, so leveraging investment, leveraging policy change, rather than subsidising or displacing public finance flows. We call it the Beyond Aid agenda in the UK government, and I'll try and explain a few of the mechanisms that we use as we go along. But of course, another reason that the UK is interested in supporting development here in Pakistan is because of Pakistan's very severe climate vulnerability. You know, as one of the, I think it's the 8th most climate vulnerable country in the world, there are some very, very real needs here in Pakistan in terms of providing the right kind of support for infrastructure development, not only for climate resilience and adaptation, but also for that transition to decarbonisation. Pakistan has also shown enormous leadership on climate change. I think we were all so impressed with the delegation's efforts at COP27 last year and the amazing progress that was made towards a loss and damage fund, principally led by Pakistan. And of course, the UK has played a big role in COP, not least at COP26. Yes, that deserves a clap. Fantastic effort, Pakistan, particularly Minister Sherry Rahman. Force of nature. So there's a real shared interest as well to see progress at that international level in terms of climate regulation, climate commitments. So this summit comes at a critical time for Pakistan. Inflation has surged to over 30% year on year. The Pakistani rupee has weakened to historic levels. Interest rates have risen to 20%, the highest in Asia. And credit extended by the banking sector to government has surged. The numbers are not looking good, are they, ladies and gentlemen? Finance available to the private sector is contracting, and there are growing shortages of food, fuel, and other basic essentials. From my point of view, we spend a lot of time tracking the poverty numbers here in Pakistan, and it's rising, unfortunately. There are now 27 million children out of school here in Pakistan, and 3 million of those are out of school directly as a result of the devastating floods we saw last summer. There are about 5 million people, we estimate, who are in IPC 4. That's a technical term for the food security level that is just one below a famine. So lots and lots of people facing food security issues, as other colleagues here have mentioned. So now more than ever, we need to look to make those low-carbon, climate-resilient investments that can actually shore up much greater resilience for the future. So we know that the 2022 floods are a key example of Pakistan's climate vulnerability risk. And in terms of the damage that was caused by the floods, it's estimated at 3.2 trillion rupees, with a total needs assessment of 3.5 trillion rupees. So clearly there are some huge investment needs there that we need to address. In fact, the World Bank has estimated that the total investment needs for a comprehensive response to Pakistan's climate challenges between 2023 and 2030 it's around $348 billion. That's a lot of finance. And as others have said, there is no way that even with a strong showing from the multilateral development banks and the donors, and all other sources of public finance, that there's no way that gap will be met. So there's a key role that private sector finance can play. Developing countries can secure their future infrastructure and energy requirements at low cost through the transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, and also the transition to climate-smart homes, agriculture, household appliances that can help drive a new way of economic activities and revenue generation and job creation. So even though those risk calculations made for green investments don't always crowd in the levels of private finance that are needed to make that green transition a reality. So the role of development finance is to take private capital where it would otherwise not go. It's not to sweeten the return on private capital. Development capital is meant to buy down risk and help investment projects tide over the hump to crowd in private capital. Development capital is not meant to replace private capital, and it's good to see that UK-funded investment facilities such as PIDGE, InfraCo Asia are helping to create that market and pave the way for commercial capital in some of the high-risk markets and sectors. And now, of course, InfraZamin is helping to crowd in private capital through the use of guarantees here in Pakistan, helping to solve another part of that puzzle. When it comes to promoting international support for climate resilience, the challenge is to start implementing a long-term approach and strategy to tackle climate risks. And here in Pakistan, the British High Commission and FCDO have identified 3 priority areas for international development support. So number 1, fostering climate innovation and early-stage risk capital. Number 2, working to create innovative financial instruments within the capital markets. And number 3, unlocking international climate finance. And we have a range of different instruments and investments to support these 3 key objectives in Pakistan. I'll mention just a couple. GuarantCo, so I'm delighted to see Dr. Shamsad here today. It's an organization and international organisations here to strengthen climate resilience and improve access to renewable energy. We know that the scale and urgency of the climate emergency means there is much more to do together and that we need to act much more quickly. So with all the instruments and tools that we have as the UK government, we want to continue trying to act as a catalyst to fund sustainable and transformative infrastructure here in Pakistan, crowding in unused pockets of liquidity. And we'll look to deploy a whole development finance toolkit, including our own development finance institution, British International Investment, and also bringing some of the UK's domestic strengths, our capital markets, innovation and expertise to work in helping to mobilise more private finance here to advance climate and nature goals in Pakistan. So we're really proud to have supported PIDGE, InfraCo Asia, GuarantCo, Karandaz, and of course InfraZamin, and we want to continue to build on all these strategic partnerships to help transform infrastructure here in Pakistan. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. And before I recap Jo Moyer's talk here, if you could be kind enough to please fill out the form on your table. The pencils are there, and the InfraZamin team is eagerly awaiting to collect these forms. So please fill them out. Simple forms, and actually they talk about your feedback. So a lot of generalized questions, and your feedback will really make a difference. Thank you so much. So role of development finance, and yes, please, hashtags too. Build for Impact Summit, one more. Infrastructure Summit 2023 and Building for Impact. 2 hashtags, please use them when sharing on social media, and the survey forms. Yes. Role of development finance and how it's linked with SDG. And what I really loved, 3 words, beyond aid agenda. I think Pakistan needs to be ready for that. And it's not that we lack the resources or the raw material. It's just expertise and creative approach. And we have the teams right here, actually. Moving on to green finance. Green finance in any structured financial activity that's been created to ensure a better environmental outcome. We all know that Pakistan is a frontline state when it comes to vulnerability towards environment crisis. The floods are a proof, and lack of infrastructure is a worry. Pakistan is a frontline state when it comes to climate crisis and is in dire need of sustainable measures for creating a longevity with sustainable footprint. Expanding on the green economy through green financing, we have invited our chief guest for the day. Our next speaker is the Governor of the State Bank of Pakistan, Mr. Jameel Ahmed. His illustrious career in central banking spans over 30 years. He played an instrumental role in transforming the bank supervision system by introducing risk-based methodology, issuing and implementing the latest international Basel capital adequacy standards, issuing a modern age digital banking framework, establishing a depositors protection scheme, strengthening the bank's resolution regime, and launching Pakistan's first retail payments gateway. He has also had extensive experience of working in senior positions in the areas of monetary policy and operations, exchange rate and reserve management, banking policy and regulation, banking supervision, development finance, payment systems, and financial resource management. His contributions include formulating the policy and regulatory framework for the banking systems of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and monitoring their financial soundness and stability. I request Mr. Jameel Ahmed, Governor, State Bank, Pakistan, to please take the mic for his address on sustainable infrastructure financing, the green agenda for the banking sector. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dr. Shamsad Akhtar, our former governor, and Chairperson Karandas, Mr. Andrew Brainbridge, Chair Private Infrastructure Development Group, Ms. Maheen Rahman, CEO InfraZamin, Mr. Akif Saeed, Chairman Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, our foreign guests, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. It gives me immense pleasure to be here this morning to address the Infrastructure Summit organized by InfraZamin Pakistan. At the outset, I would like to take this opportunity to commend InfraZamin for arranging this much needed summit on sustainable infrastructure financing. I hope that this newly established entity will play an active role for the infrastructure development in Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, infrastructure development is considered an essential requirement for economic growth of any country, owing to its linkages with different sectors of the economy. Investment in infrastructures like energy, telecommunication, sanitation, transport network helps to increase competitiveness, improve productivity, facilitate economic development, and enhance social well-being of the society. However, it is challenging to finance infrastructure development and its maintenance, which requires huge amount of capital. Therefore, there is often a demand-supply gap when it comes to availability of adequate infrastructure. Globally, around 3.6 billion people are estimated to lack access to sanitation facilities, whereas 2 billion people do not have access to safe drinking water. Around 1 billion people are unable to get access to health facilities. Majority of these people are in the Asia-Pacific region. This situation has actually worsened after the COVID-19. Prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19, US $80 trillion were estimated to be required up to 2030 to bridge the global infrastructure gap and fight climate change. According to an Islamic Financial Services Board working paper, on average, emerging and developing economies are expected to spend around 4.5% of their GDP on new infrastructure projects. This is in addition to the estimated 2.7% of GDP spending on operations and maintenance of existing infrastructure. In absolute terms, the required amount to finance the infrastructure investment is estimated to be around $920 billion per annum. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all can observe, that Pakistan faces acute lack of infrastructure facilities, including energy, communication networks, water and sanitation, educational institutions, and recreational facilities. Last year's floods have further worsened our aging infrastructure. According to the Post-Disaster Needs Assessment report, Pakistan requires US $16 billion in recovery and reconstruction costs. And this even does not include the expected cost from disease, lack of food, and clean water. Pakistan's needs are massive, but unfortunately, our resources are limited to develop sustainable infrastructure. Our infrastructure spending, being at 2.1% of GDP, is among the lowest in the region and well below the required national average of 8 to 10% of GDP. Infrastructure projects, by their very nature and design, require relatively large investment, besides requiring longer gestation period for development, construction, startup, and operation. Historically, infrastructure projects have been mainly in the government domain. The government has managed, financed, owned, and operated these projects. However, considering the fiscal constraints, the government is now encouraging the private sector, including financial institutions, to play a greater role in building and maintaining sustainable infrastructure projects through public-private partnerships. Globally, it is evident that public-private partnerships improve the efficiency and quality of service and allow the public funds to be available for other sectors where private investment is not possible. Ladies and gentlemen, being a proactive regulator and recognizing the importance of infrastructure financing in the country, State Bank of Pakistan issued infrastructure projects financing guidelines in 2005. These guidelines were updated in 2010 to further promote infrastructure financing in the country. SBP issued prudential regulations for infrastructure financing in 2016. These regulations were developed after extensive consultations with internal as well as external stakeholders. These regulations emphasize important features of infrastructure financing, which facilitate banks and DFIs to access the cash flow generating capacity of the projects. This included the requirement of technical feasibility, comprehensive risk assessment, project insurance, technical monitoring of the project during loan tenure, and requirement of supply and offtake agreements. In Pakistan, banks and DFIs have provided major part of the credit for financing infrastructure projects in the private sector. However, given the significant demand-supply gap, where banks and DFIs needs to enhance their exposure, the role of the capital markets cannot be overemphasized. Ladies and gentlemen, now coming to sustainable aspect. Let me share with you that SBP is cognizant of Pakistan's vulnerabilities to environmental challenges, especially climate change, and how it translates into infrastructure damages in the country. The widespread flooding last year has left 1/3 of the country underwater and displaced around 33 million people. Apart from the immeasurable human tragedy, these floods had impacted the cash flow of businesses, which ultimately translate into financial risks for the banks. In this backdrop, the State Bank has already taken certain steps. For example, green banking guidelines were issued in 2017. These were aimed to reduce the vulnerabilities of banks to environmental and climate risks, and to encourage financing for transitioning to a sustainable and climate-resilient economy. It is worth mentioning that since the issuance of green banking guidelines, banks are in continuous process of implementing green and sustainable banking practices in the country. Recently, in November 2022, the State Bank has also issued environmental and social risk management implementation manual for banks and financial institutions. This is basically an improved version of the green banking guidelines, particularly with respect to environmental, social, and climate risk management. SBP has provided 3 years to banks and DFIs to implement the manual. SBP has also allowed this ample time, keeping in view that banks and DFIs are required to establish their environmental and social risk management systems and procedures, and to integrate the same with their credit risk management procedures in a gradual and phased manner. However, we will encourage them to have faster implementation of this manual. Apart from regulatory interventions, the SBP has also introduced financing scheme for renewable energy, both in conventional and Sharia compliant modes. Under this scheme, concessionary financing is available at a maximum end user rate of 6% per annum for power generation of up to 50 megawatt projects using alternative and renewable energy sources. These may include use of solar, wind, hydro, biogas, biofuels, bagasse cogeneration, and geothermal sources of energy. This scheme not only promotes use of clean energy, but also contributes towards the development of sustainable infrastructure in power sector in Pakistan. I'm happy to share that the scheme has made remarkable progress, with banks providing financing to more than 2,300 projects, with a cumulative capacity of almost 1,600 megawatts under this scheme. This progress ultimately contributes to the government's target to achieve 30% renewable energy share in the total generation mix under the Alternate and Renewable Energy Policy 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, in the end, I would like to reiterate that the role of financial industry is vital in bridging the demand-supply gap of sustainable infrastructure development, which is critical for overall economic development of the country. The financial services industry has to develop innovative mechanisms and products to cater to the unmet needs of these large-scale and long-term projects. On behalf of State Bank, let me assure you that within our mandate, we will continue to play our role in promoting sustainable infrastructure financing and facilitate the financial institutions in building their capacity in this regard. I wish you at the end a very insightful and productive discussion ahead during today's conference. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jameel Saab. It was really heartening to hear about the green initiatives that the State Bank is working on and working with. And yes, investment in infrastructure is directly linked to productivity and well-being, as you mentioned. And before we go into Q&A session, because we've got this absolute treasure trove of solid information on what to do, how to do, where to do, with already ready-made good pilot projects working towards progress for developing economies. So before we jump into the Q&A, and we will have time for 3 questions here, I have one question, and you know, I've been a teacher for the past 3 decades, I think, before I joined communications. So if everybody has filled out a form, next, I may ask you to raise your hands because I'm used to doing that. But if yes, and I would request the volunteers please to start collecting the forms so that they can be in one place. And thank you so much for complying with that. So we have time for 3 questions with our very illustrious panel here regarding issues that Pakistan has, regarding the kind of financing that we may need, and what and how to do this. Yes, please. Mike, please. And please introduce yourself, sir. And do mention whom you wish to ask the question to.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ehsan Jabbar. My family is involved with the development of industrial park in Nooriabad, spread over 1,000 acres. And my question could be to the entire panel, that do we have a master plan where when we talk about PPP, the government is saying that these are the sectors and these are the locations where the development needs to happen. I'll quote an example. There's a Ravi urban development taking place, so much controversy behind it. So when we're talking about infrastructure development, we also need to have a clear policy from the government side that which sectors are we looking for investments in, which are the areas are we looking at geographically, are the utilities and power and everything, security available over there? So that's my question, that are these areas identified? For example, is there a Silicon Valley place identified in Pakistan to be developed? So that's my question. Thank you. Any panel could answer that.
Who would like to take this question? Maheen?
Sure. So I can't speak for government specifically, but I can speak for the sectors that you've identified. And yes, we've also looked at that Ravi project. So the challenge really is, beyond the approvals that you need from government, is the project itself. And now we've worked with project owners for the last year and a half almost, and we find the same issues again and again and again. And what are those issues? Number one is the project has not been clearly developed in terms of its objective. So what is the purpose behind that project? If it's a residential community, and we've looked at affordable housing as well, right? Ravi is not affordable, but it's more middle income. But the challenge we found there, that there was a lack of fully scoping out the project in a manner which would bring it to the point of financing. So even before the financing could be put in place, all the bits and pieces that were required from project finance were not even in place. So specifically on affordable housing, the way we looked at it is we worked with a few developers who had experience in that area, who had clear land earmarked to them, either through themselves privately or through the government. But even then, we found that there were significant gaps in how they were going to be able to sell those houses to homeowners, how those homeowners were actually going to end up financing those houses as well, and then also what was the actual structuring around the project, what was the debt requirement, what was the equity requirement, and so on and so forth. So the way we've handled that is to really bring in advisory channels, to build that project up to be more bankable. Because even before we can talk about financing, we have to make sure that all the relevant points of the project are very clearly sort of outlined, the financial models are developed, and then you can go ahead and say, okay, how can we finance something like this? So I remember very early on in the InfraZamin days, we also worked with PMRC and a couple of banks to see, can we develop frameworks where we guarantee developers, where we guarantee the mortgage products, and just have banks as a sort of liquidity providers. And it's unfortunate that the affordable housing conversation never really took off in that manner. So where we are finding opportunity is in those very sectors where projects need to be developed. So once a project is sort of identified, there is a whole area of advisory that needs to come through before that project can come to the banking or to the capital market. And we've spent quite a lot of time working with project owners to build them up, to that level. So a lot of the work is in preparation. Once the preparation is completed, then the financing elements can take over.
Thank you, Maheen. Yes.
So I think there are a number of special economic zones which have been developed by the government, and I know there have been a number of incentives also provided. So this is an opportunity for the private sector maybe to also explore investment in those projects. And similarly, I know there are certain private developers also working in various infrastructure projects, so that's another opportunity. And then IT-related infrastructure is another opportunity where private sector can come forward. And similarly, there are certain mega projects also which the government want to develop through public-private partnerships. So I think there are many opportunities. Financing obviously is an issue, and for that banks and financial institutions will also have to play their role. Maybe not all the financing requirements can be met through the equity financing, so banks have a major role to play, and that's the reason we have issued these guidelines for banks also, so that they can have the necessary regulatory framework under which they can operate and can come forward and provide financing to these mega projects.
Thank you, Jamit Saab. Aswar, with your former experience with Board of Investments and State, would you like to add? Not right now, later? Okay. We are ready for the next question, please. A question on financing, infrastructure, the kind of issues that Pakistan faces. A simple road drive across the land gives us all the logistical insights into what we really need to do. Okay, we'll start with our, yes, we have a question.
Hello.
Assalamu
alaikum ji. My name is Zubair Habib. I developed the first 3 special economic zones in Pakistan. Yeah? And we had a Section 42 company in the Ministry of Industries, which is called National Industrial Parks. I just wanted to share my positive experiences on how we made these success stories. First, of course, the land that we identified was land that was not being utilized by the government, yeah. Some of it was partially encroached also, yeah. And we were able to, of course, get it vacated and cleaned up. The second was that we were able to get a GOP guarantee so we could go and get a loan from any of the banks. And yes, we had to work with the government a little bit, Ministry of Finance, but we were able to get that. And you can see today these projects are running, and you can see that they are the state of the art. So I think if government wants infrastructure development at a reasonable cost, where factories are going to come up, one of the stipulations that we had was anybody who bought this land, because obviously the government is putting in a sweetener, giving very concessional financing, that was that this land cannot be transferred unless it's built upon, yeah. I don't think private developers can do that, but I think if they can work with the government on some sort of a scheme where they're able to finance these projects, there is a great deal of demand. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to hear positive stories. Yes, any more questions? Should we move to our... Yes. Yes, of course. The mic here, please.
The name is Sohail P. Ahmed. Maheen, you just mentioned that we had devastation in floods because of not doing right in the irrigation. So is something being done, or we'll face that again? And Jamil Saab, you talked a lot about green revolution. Surely that point would be there in your work, whatever you're doing about green revolution. You can't have green revolution if we have floods every 2 years or a year.
True, thank you. So I will start and Jamil Saab can finish. So I'm very happy someone brings up the flood issue, because I think that's the biggest regret that I think Pakistan should really face is not putting together a flood protection plan. Now, India put in a plan about 3 or maybe about 5 years ago. Bangladesh did it about maybe longer. For every dollar that Bangladesh spent on flood protection, they saved almost $200 in damages. For every dollar that India put into flood rehabilitation, they saved almost $150 in damages. Now, back in 2011, when the first large flood hit us, and that made headlines, the government at that time did start on a flood protection plan. So they actually engaged an international consultant, a Dutch consultant by the name of Deleteris, who produced in 2016 a very large 130-page report, which was called the National Flood Protection Plan 4, which was due to be implemented in 2016. And that was a countrywide plan, which included a complete revamp of the irrigation system. It included a complete assessment and rehabilitation of the drainage mechanisms, including water reservoirs. It included actually flood radars, which were early warning signals of how floods would come in. And this was a plan that was placed before the federal government, was placed before the provincial government at the time. But unfortunately, due to political unrest and instability, the government changed. This was the switch from, say, the Nawaz Sharif-led government, so he was removed from Prime Minister at the time. And the election process for 2018 actually commenced at that time. Now, in all that mayhem, we forgot about that plan. And it wasn't only until recently last year that that plan was dusted off the shelf and revived by the current government, who is now looking to update that. So I think this really highlights what we could have saved ourselves from in 2022 had we actually gone ahead with the 2016 plan and looking at financing options. We even had the funding for that somewhat lined up, and the rest was going to come from various other sources. But I think it's a true pity that we were not able to execute such a plan in the first place. And it's great that we're looking at that again now from the Federal Planning Ministry. But I think that's the real sort of challenge you see in Pakistan, where just the political upheaval and cycle alone can cause significant damage to not just our entire agri cycle, but also affect our food security for the entire country of 200 million people. So, you know, the kind of political unrest we're seeing, the kind of issues that we are seeing constantly come up, these are now carrying real economic cost for us. And I think it's very imperative that as stakeholders, and we've got the central bank, we've got the SCCP, we have all the, you know, the sort of banks and the private sector here. It's very important to recognize that we cannot continue in this form. And we have to begin to separate the economics from the politics and find ways to build out long-term planning, long-term strategic objectives, which will not be derailed just because we are going through a political cycle. So, you know, that is really what happens when we talk about flood protection. And it is my hope that now that we have the plan in place or looking to be updated, we are able to, and we are ready as InfraZamin to play our part in raising financing for that aspect as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think I can add that from central bank perspective, promoting green financing is one of the agenda which is part of our strategic plan on which we are working, and we will be promoting green financing during our various efforts during the next 5 years. And since unfortunately, some of our attention has recently diverted to other areas, and that's the reason work on this one has somewhat slowed down. But we will soon be out of these issues related to external side, and then we will refocus on promoting these green financing and other banking-related issues and other central banking issues which are part of our agenda for the next 5 years. So, so you will see soon we will be re-engaging banks on promoting green financing. Already we have issued certain guidelines, and we have already issued a manual for banks to implement, and then now we'll be focusing on implementation side of these guidelines and a manual, and we'll also be coming out some further initiatives so that we can ensure that banks are taking required actions to promote green financing in the country, because we know environmental issues are, I mean, their importance and the role which the banks can play in addressing those issues through green financing. So, so it is one of the agenda on which we will be working.
Lovely. That sounds really, really heartening to know that green financing is going to be a main tangent and a core of what finance system will be working with. I will now, time for us to share a token of our appreciation, a beautiful, wonderful book by Nadeem Farooq Paracha actually, and I just happened to have a look at it before we began the ceremony, and I was quite taken by the colorful illustrations and the kind of look that the book has into the last 75 years of the evolution of popular culture in Pakistan. And it is with the political, economic, and the entertainment perspective. The illustrations are absolutely mind-blowing, and it is a book to have. I would request Mohammad Aswar Ehsan and Maheen to please be with our chief guest, Dr. Jameel Sahab. And Jameel Sahab, I would request you to present the token to first Joe Moyer here, please. It's a beautiful book. I'll again request you, Jameel Saab, to present the token to Laith Al-Falaki. And I would now request Maheen to present the token to our chief guest, Jameel Sahab. have a group photograph now, please? Thank you, Dr. Shamshad, for joining us on stage for the group photograph. With the heartfelt thanks to our illustrious panel, we close the inaugural session for the day. Before we jump into our second session of conversations and dialogue, there's a lovely, refreshing tea waiting for us. And please make sure that your survey forms are done, because the team needs to mail them. Thank you so much. We'll see you shortly. Enjoy your tea.
For Pakistan, infrastructure is important, whether it comes in the form of private sector or it comes in the form of public sector. Our requirements are 9 to 10% of GDP. We are only able to spend about 2% of GDP on our entire infrastructure needs. So that means that we are just building up a gap that gets wider and wider every year.
To actually get people out of poverty, you have to build infrastructure.
And by infrastructure we mean, physical infrastructure, roads, but we're also thinking about renewable energy, telecoms, communication.
You can't get people out of poverty if they don't have access to roads, access to communications, access to green energy, access to water. And that's another area. Water is becoming a real focus area, particularly with climate change.
It means more floods in the future, more droughts in the future. Our entire agri-economy could be at stake here. Our food supplies could be at stake here. So we have a lot to lose if we don't look at things in a sustainable way.
It's so important if we're building infrastructure that we do that correctly at some of the best-in-class health, safety, and environmental standards.
We're mandated to alleviate poverty, but we're also mandated to deliver impacts and deliver project benefits. And we cannot deliver sustainable development impact if we are not protecting the people, the workers and the communities working on and living around and using that infrastructure.
Labour management, health and safety, occupational health and safety, social impacts, the environmental impacts, the security impacts, all under one framework.
So as a business owner, as a factory owner, I need to be thinking about these things today. Because these are not small projects. To set up a renewable energy project is a 3-4 year exercise.
One of the major challenges that we come across, we're told time and time again, good HSES practice is not possible in Pakistan. It's not done here. You'll find this difficult. And to that we say, we've worked here since 2013. We've closed 6 transactions. That means 6 companies have met best international HSES practice. And it has been done and it can be done.
We see ourselves as active investors, not passive. We don't just tick the boxes and ensure there's some legal rubric in the documentation and we're happy and we move on. It's about helping our projects and our partners that we support on that journey.
And we acknowledge companies are at different stages in their HSES journey. So we understand where they are in that journey and what support they need to get to where we need them to be.
To build a strong health and safety culture, it comes from leadership from the top and making sure that the message is set by the leaders at board level.
We have a strong focus on capacity building, so we'll proactively work with our companies to raise, embed, instill and improve their HSES governance and culture.
Everyone is held to account in the end. So it's really, really important that you bring the governance to Pakistan and you help Pakistan raise the standards.
It's not just Page, but all of the other DFIs and even the private banks are now seeing ESG as a non-negotiable key element of their investment and tying in that, as well as pricing, one of the main requirements of their involvement in projects.
We can work with both the bank market as well as the Sukuk market, Sukuk and TFC market. So it's very simple. You have a loan. The bank is not comfortable with the borrower. It's not comfortable with the risk. All we simply do is, if we like the project and we really look at the project on a cash flow basis, on a commercial viability basis, and on a risk basis, and we see how we can address our risks, and if we take that project on, we will give a guarantee to the bank against that project. So should that project end up in default, the bank can call our guarantee, and our guarantees are always unconditional and irrevocable once they have been issued.
These longer term tenure projects have a higher credit risk. So I think the role of InfraZamin will be very critical and very helpful and actually in bridging that gap.
And our aim is that once we do bring bonds to the market, they should be rated in the AA plus or the AAA category with our credit rating behind us.
You have to enable the first or the second round of such transactions, and after those, you would expect that the market and the rest of the stakeholders will then allow it to flourish and prosper on its own.
We can then develop the bond market in a way that many more sectors are considered rather than just simply power and banks.
We've seen this in Nigeria. It does not happen overnight. It does not happen simply from InfraZamin launching a product into the market. It needs all stakeholders within that market, who I know all want the same thing. They all want to see greater flows of capital going into the market. Of course, there are some macroeconomic headwinds as there are across the globe that Pakistan has to deal with. But the fundamentals of a large market and high quality resource of human capital, I think is what makes me at least very excited about the future for Pakistan.
So the infrastructure development here in the telecom side is going through its next phase with the fiberization of the country.
For Pakistan to go into the next phase of its development, we need to be digital. We need to have access to bandwidth. We need to have access to connectivity. And I don't think that's possible unless you build the infrastructure.
This transaction will double Multinet's capability in terms of providing internet access to underserved cities in Pakistan, to the SME segment, and to populations that previously did not have access to that digital infrastructure. When we look at a lot of companies in Pakistan, you will find that they get stuck at a certain level. They are unable to cross that barrier. It's not just funding alone that will do it, which is where the impact of InfraZamin can also be understood. So we have instituted transparency, reporting, and governance structures within Multinet as well as part of our transaction. So Multinet will have a board, they will have independent directors, they will have an audit committee, they will have an internal audit assessment, thereby bringing that transparency and disclosure framework within the company itself. And that will not only assist in terms of our understanding of Multinet, but also enable them in the future to raise funds from far bigger institutions, thereby getting over that hump of initial access to capital to achieve the next rate of growth. The other area that we are very, very focused on is health and safety, particularly of workers, and particularly when you're involved in network outreach or developing network infrastructure, health and safety of communities, of the workforce, ensuring gender balance in terms of the company. So Adnan at Multinet will create new jobs in the process of this expansion, and we have committed from him that 20% of those jobs will come from women.
Investment in infrastructure, it's not the cash capital as much as the patience capital is what you need. It does not give a return next day, next morning, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. It's like a long time horizon.
At the end of the day, a bank has limitations. So we do have risk parameters. And InfraZamin and institutions like that, adding their weight behind it helps to allay some of the risk concerns.
I think we've demonstrated that we can take risk off bank balance sheets. We can absorb a certain amount of risk and assess that risk for ourselves.
And I think InfraZamin, because of the board that they have, they're coming from a background, I think that is the key objective, to be able to take those kind of risks out for the bankers to be able to be more comfortable to invest with us.
And I think that's precisely the reason that InfraZamin is here. We are a catalyst to enable that lending through credit enhancement and through credit guarantees.
The first transaction is a milestone, and it would open up the gates of everyone interested to getting support.
And in doing so, I think we are here to give the market a lot of comfort in terms of, hey, we're here to handle the credit risk, and eventually the market will begin to price that risk itself.
We expect financiers to look at what we do and the light we shine on good companies, and in time they're just going to say, we don't need a guarantee anymore, we want to support you on similar terms.
Hopefully going forward this is easy to replicate. A borrower comes in, the bank assesses that they can borrow X amount, but they want Y. So then the difference between X and Y is bridged by risk sharing through an institution like InfraZamin.
The multi-net transaction with HBL Bank is a great demonstration of how InfraZamin can catalyze private sector investment in a critical sector like telecommunications. We are looking to replicate this model across other infrastructure sectors such as renewable energy, water, waste management, and others.
And on behalf of the shareholders, we see a bright future for InfraZamin, not only for our success, but in delivering infrastructure financing solutions for Pakistan.
For Pakistan, infrastructure is important, whether it comes in the form of private sector or it comes in the form of public sector. Our requirements are 9 to 10% of GDP. We are only able to spend about 2% of GDP on our entire infrastructure needs. So that means that we are just building up a gap that gets wider and wider every year.
To actually get people out of poverty, you have to build infrastructure.
And by infrastructure, we mean, physical infrastructure, roads, but we're also thinking about renewable energy, telecoms, communication.
You can't get people out of poverty if they don't have access to roads, access to communications, access to green energy, access to water. And that's another area. Water is becoming a real focus area, particularly with climate change.
It means more floods in the future, more droughts in the future. Our entire agri-economy could be at stake here. Our food supplies could be at stake here. So we have a lot to lose if we don't look at things in a sustainable way.
It's so important if we're building infrastructure that we do that correctly at some of the best-in-class health, safety, and environmental standards.
We're mandated to alleviate poverty, but we're also mandated to deliver impact, so deliver project benefits. And we cannot deliver sustainable development impact if we are not protecting the people, the workers and the communities working on and living around and using that infrastructure.
Labour management, health and safety, occupational health and safety, social impacts, the environmental impacts, the security impacts, all under one framework.
So as a business owner, as a factory owner, I need to be thinking about these things today, because these are not small projects. To set up a renewable energy project is a 3-4 year exercise.
Conversations coming up and dialogue panels. I'll request everyone in the tea and refreshment area to please join us back in the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have you back.
Can I leave it?
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have you back in the hall for us to start the second session. We have a wonderful conversation ahead of us. Please take your seats and bring your chai along. Please bring your cup of tea. Just like Naz is doing that. Great. That's the way to go. So we have a wonderful conversation coming up, and I'll be requesting Maheen to join us back on stage with Laith Al-Falaki. And you've already been introduced to both of them, so I'm going to quote verbatim from a website. If I could have everyone seated for us to begin the second session, a delightfully interesting one. I was just talking to Laith and I was telling him how out of depth I felt when I started reading up on infrastructure financing, and how fascinated I am. The more I know, the deeper I feel for this, and I feel it is a perfect solution to the problems that face us today. And we have the expertise right here in this room, whether in the context of conceptualization or implementation. If I could have everybody taking their seats. Thank you, Faisal. So we have this delightful conversation coming up with Maheen Rahman and Laith Al-Falaki. I'll request both the guests to join us back on stage. You've been introduced to both of them, so I'll skip the introduction and I'll dive deep into a quotation that I confess I copy-pasted from the website, but it looked so beautiful. We transform economies and improve lives. I'm loving the connection of work with quality of life, the way it is being cemented through and through. Through the application of a theory of change, we mobilize private sector funding, leveraging public sector funding, and blending it with private sector investment for local, regional, and international sources, and debt or equity from development finance institutions, or DFIs as we know them, to achieve greater impact and to change lives. PIDG's tagline also is changing lives, and I absolutely love that. I think Maheen said in one of the earlier sessions that profit without purpose. Am I right, Maheen? Yes? So the companies will no longer be able to have profit without a purpose. And here this conversation is actually illustrating this very paradigm, that work will have to have a purpose and the profit will be by default if it is good work. So the tagline for PIDG is also pioneering infrastructure and changing lives. And if you could just go through the list of outcomes that they have on that chart on the website, you will be as convinced as I am, if not more. So the conversation is going to focus on lessons from the PIDG experience on blended finance. How can Pakistan progress on this route will form the core of this conversation, and Maheen will engage our guest and our speaker, Laith Al-Falaki, over the questions and the queries and possible solutions. So over to you, Maheen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm very pleased to be moderating a one-on-one session with Laith right now, because I think there were a lot of concepts discussed in the sort of inaugural session that in my mind, and perhaps in the minds of many here, probably raise more questions than answers. So it's one thing to talk about having capital to deploy. It's always easy to say we have the equity, we have the debt, we have the guarantee frameworks, etc. But the reality is to put these concepts into practice requires a lot of sort of heavy structuring and a lot of comfort that needs to be given to the private sector to bring that capital in. Today, at 20% interest rates, it's easier to go buy a 6-month treasury bill than to talk about building a road or building a dam or building an irrigation system. So how do we do it in this environment where today Pakistan is sort of staring down the barrel of another IMF program with its very heavy conditionalities, and given that things are only going to get worse from here, what can we really expect from the private sector, and are there other countries in the world that we can possibly learn from? So I'm glad that Laith is here to discuss some of this with me. But perhaps, Laith, we can start by talking a little bit about PIDGE. It's an institution which is over 2 decades old, and it has a mandate to build infrastructure on commercial terms in frontier markets and use local markets to finance rather than international markets. So how would you describe PIDGE to our audience, and what is PIDGE's core mandate, and what has been the impact so far that PIDGE has managed to create in other countries?
Thanks, Maheen. Thank you, Maheen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, actually, we have a video which tells you a bit about PIDGE, because we've just celebrated our 20th anniversary, so maybe we'll put that on in a moment. But firstly, I mean, we look at ourselves as a catalyst. We don't look at ourselves as someone who has all the solutions, but someone who can help crowd in the private sector. And you talk about structuring, and that, of course, is really important because we have to give that comfort to the private sector. But I think where the journey starts is the risk appetite, because these private institutions, they don't have the risk appetite, they have all the structuring in the world. If you gave them this project and you said structure it, they would do so in a way that made it, mitigated the principal risks and reduced the risk of loss. That's what they do in their day jobs. But what they don't have is a mandate to enter into these markets, and I think that is the role that we can play. I mean, before I became CEO of GuarantCo, I was the CRO at PIDGE, and I'll recite to you actually an interesting story of one of my very first days at PIDGE. I was meeting the owners, as we call them, or our donor entities, and I was going to go through with them my plan and my thoughts on risk appetite. And the day before I was meeting Andy Bainbridge, who's our chair, and he hopefully will be able to join us some point later today. And we sat down and I went through it with him, and he said, so let me get this straight. In very simplistic terms, you're saying we need to be more active in areas where there is less risk. And I've been in financial services at that point for about 23 years. That was my mindset. So I said, well, of course, in very simplistic terms, that's what we need to look at. And he said, no. That is not what this organization is about. We need to be at the frontier. We need to be where there is need, and where there is need, there is more risk. So actually, over the last in my first few years at Pidge, we developed a risk appetite, which obviously focused on risk, but also focused on need, and that is really vital. And I think by focusing on need, we have been able to then enter into those markets and do the sort of deals that we believe are well structured, that when the private sector comes in, they can see they're well structured. Of course, they need a nudge. You know, we do 100% guarantee day one. We certainly shouldn't be getting out then, because they're not going to follow us. Then by the 5th transaction in country, hopefully they're getting a bit more comfortable. They may be able to take a bit more naked risk. And you can see actually that ethos of Pidge actually coming through in the numbers, because over 50% of the transactions that we have done over a 20-year period, so over 100 of our transactions have been in what we call FCAS countries, or fragile and conflict-affected states. And over 50% have been in DAC 1 and 2 countries on the ODA scale, so some of the lowest income countries. So, you know, we've walked the talk, and I think that's what sets us apart, because we then start with that risk appetite, and that allows us then to crowd in the private sector further down the line.
Great, thank you. And I think you
Shall I put the video on, Maheen?
In a minute, yeah.
Okay.
We'll come to the video. Yeah. But if we have to talk about practical examples, what would you identify over the last, say, 20 years or so, or the transactions that stand out in your mind that have made a clear difference in the countries? So when we talk about impact and we measure it, we say, okay, Pidge has actually mobilized almost $40 billion of private sector capital into projects, has worked across 40 plus countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa, has impacted over 220 million people in terms of improved access to infrastructure, and at the same time has created almost 250,000 to 300,000 jobs directly in the markets themselves. So obviously the impact element is there. But out of all of that, what stands out for you as being your key success stories, if you could pick one or two transactions that you think really changed the game?
Picking one or two is a bit of a challenge, so maybe I'll go for 3 or 4 if you'll permit me. When I first joined Pidge, actually, as all prospective employees do, they look at the websites, right, and they look and study. And what really stood out for me at that time was a project that was just coming on stream at the time, which was in Rwanda. And it was a water project that was going to be providing 500,000 people with access to clean, drinkable water, potable water, who hadn't had it before. That was really inspirational to me, and when I came on board, I thought, my God, you know, because I'd heard all these stories about how difficult water was, how no one could do water projects, etc. And here was an entity that was breaking new ground. Of course, when I got in the door, I realised just how difficult water was actually, and how difficult it still is. But I think that is a beacon project that we need to look to see if we can replicate in other countries. And of course, I realise that water is a political football in a lot of countries, but I think that's where it all starts. And in fact, that takes me probably to the next project. When I was in Zambia, I was on a visit there, and I visited a project that InfraCo Africa had put equity into. And I sat down under a tree with the head man and the head woman of the village. And they said to me, we only need 2 things. We need land, we have land, and we need water. And you're bringing the water through irrigation. That allowed them to grow their crops. It allowed them to take those crops to market, the market gardens. That then generated economic activity. That was able to then send their kids to school, access to electricity, and all this came through water. So I'm really passionate about water. I think you're getting that, and I think it's something we need to do more of. Sadly, it is proving very difficult. And then looking at GuarantCo itself, I think one of the things that we do differently is that we mobilize capital markets. And I think that is really fundamental. And I take great pride in, obviously you are you should take the most pride in InfraZamin, but I think the idea of credit enhancement facilities, local credit enhancement facilities, and being able to crowd in pension funds, institutional money, is absolutely vital. And so when I look at what we've done in Nigeria, I think we can replicate. And that started small. It took a long time. I think you're actually ahead of the curve in terms of doing the first transaction. You've managed to do it within the first year. I think it took InfraCredit Nigeria a couple of years before they did a single transaction, and their portfolio built up very slowly. But as you mentioned in your opening remarks, they're now going great guns, and they're doing these really big bond transactions in country with the economic zone there. So I think we could, and they've also been able to attract significantly more equity as well, as people have seen the entity develop, and I hope that happens for InfraZamin as well. And I think that crowding in that local element is absolutely vital. I take great pride in that. And then more recently, you mentioned Axis Bank in India. I think that is a great opportunity for us. We had this idea that actually, why talk about individual projects? Why not be programmatic? And let's see who we can partner with on these sort of programmatic ventures. And EV is absolutely vital. It's vital across the world. It's as vital in emerging economies as it is in developed economies. And I think if we can do something similar, and it doesn't necessarily have to be EV, it can be a climate resilience, it can be climate mitigation, it can be any of these key thematic pieces that we want, and let's find strategic partners that we can team up with and then do really quick executable transactions using local knowledge on the ground. And I think that's what we've done with Axis, and we hope to roll that out across other countries in which we're active.
Great, thank you. And those are sizable transactions. So Axis Bank was $200 million, all using local currency to finance EV projects. And similarly for the economic zone that he's talking about in Nigeria, that was $150 million with debt all raised locally from the local markets against a 20-year bond. Now, you know, we're all familiar with the way our capital markets work here, and right now it's hard to place anything over 6 months to a year. But here we have other countries managing to pull off 20-year debt in those markets. And I think that's where we eventually have to try and think about how to transition to as well. So we do have a short video around Pitch, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what Pitch's plans for Pakistan specifically are as well. So are we playing something?
We are the Private Infrastructure Development Group. For 20 years, we've mobilized private sector investment to deliver infrastructure projects in regions where investment doesn't otherwise flow and where the infrastructure gap is the greatest. Access to infrastructure like energy, water, communication, and transport shapes how people live and what opportunities they have. It determines the future of societies and of our planet. As an impact investor, our work supports the growth of sustainable and inclusive economies in the most challenging markets.
We are bringing infrastructure solutions to those who need them most, with an inspiring list of first-of-its-kind projects from renewable energy to local capital markets.
We invest in Africa and South and Southeast Asia, delivering projects in the most fragile and economically disadvantaged regions, where we've seen firsthand the transformative impact that infrastructure can have in reducing poverty. Our projects have provided necessities like water, energy, housing, and communications to over 220 million people, directly created 250,000 local jobs, and supported many more indirectly. Our investments make a real difference to people, we map our contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals and drive high standards in health and safety and environmental and social performance.
We are an active investor with impact at the core of what we do, and we deliberately incorporate climate and gender lens in all our investments.
In our first 20 years, Page has seen 190 infrastructure projects reach financial close, which have mobilized $37.6 billion and contributed to building sustainable economies, transforming markets, empowering underserved communities, and supporting livelihoods. We have consistently delivered groundbreaking investments, like the first large-scale renewable projects funded by the private sector, or the first green bonds in several countries. Page's mission is even more relevant today as the world recovers from an unprecedented pandemic and as we face the urgent climate emergency.
We are investing in the regions with the lowest historic greenhouse gas emissions, the regions that are the most vulnerable to climate change, and also the regions with the youngest and fastest growing populations in the world.
The climate crisis is the biggest threat the world has faced, and we need urgent action now. Page will continue to deliver the inclusive infrastructure needed to build a sustainable future, working with businesses, investors, and communities to adapt to climate change and deliver positive impact at scale.
Great. So, Pakistan. Page has been working here, I think, for the last 7 or 8 years.
Correct.
But what brings you here today, given the juncture that we are at? And what are your plans on how you would like to be deeper involved in the country?
That's a great question, Maheen. Of course, everyone is now looking at Pakistan and saying, you know, what's happening with the IMF? There are all these other big problems. We've talked about the floods, etc. And people are expecting people to retrench from Pakistan, and that's not who we are. I mean, if you look at, go back to the story I was telling about being where we're needed, we believe that we are really needed here. And now we have a foothold in the country with InfraCo. I think Zafar played a key role in getting us in doing our first transactions in Pakistan. There is, the need is greater than ever, and I see a huge need in climate resilience. I see a huge need in developing capital markets. We have to find a way of getting investment in through the capital markets. I think that is key. And what we believe that our expertise that we've demonstrated elsewhere through trying to attract maybe impact investors, social investors into some of our bond issuances can work just as well in Pakistan. And maybe that helps get the ball running. So if we can do some green bonds or we can do some social bonds, then we'll look to do that. I mean, clearly we have to go beyond just climate mitigation, but climate resilience is absolutely fundamental here as well. And I think getting capital market investment is going to be key to that.
And you've just opened the door to my next question, which was related to bonds. So how do we convince, and we've got asset managers here, we've got bank treasuries here, how would you go about convincing a private sector investor like a pension fund, very risk averse, how would you convince them to put their money into a 15-year infrastructure bond?
I'm not saying it's easy, of course not. And I think that the key is proof of concept. So normally when we do a bond transaction, we'll work with those investors and we will typically guarantee 100% of that bond.
So 100% of the credit risk you're willing to take off the project?
We will take that, and that actually allows those investors to actually see the project, understand GuarantCo and what makes us comfortable and the credit lenses that we look through. And further down the line, we hope that we will do second bond, third bond, and we will reduce the guarantee amount that we need to put in. We realised that people who are guarding pension fund money want to do so safely. They're not just going to take, risks that are going to put that money, in jeopardy. But we, I think, have seen this proof of concept work elsewhere. I mean, even just your neighbours in Bangladesh, we did a bond there for an agri-processing capex project, where we got one of the biggest insurers involved, and we did 100% guarantee. We're now talking about doing a second bond there in Bangladesh with that same entity, with the same investor, but with them taking 75% risk. In between times, they've also taken naked risk for the very first time on another project. So once they see your processes and they understand that those risks can be mitigated, you can get them in on the journey. It goes back to my initial point of, it starts with risk appetite. Their risk appetite is always low at the start. If you can widen that, you can then demonstrate that within that risk appetite, they can invest safely.
And I think that's the key point, right? So how do you wrap the instrument? So the instrument is now actually rated AAA. And in the context of GuarantCo, their rating is actually higher than our own sovereign rating. So our sovereign rating is CAAA, but GuarantCo's rating is, I think, AA by Moody's?
AA minus by Fitch and A1, which is the equivalent of A plus by Moody's. Yeah.
Right, so you're actually rated higher than the sovereign. So when you come in and guarantee a bond, then all of a sudden you've eliminated a significant portion of credit risk just off the table for the investor. So that's a very powerful tool to have. How do you see that in the context of the Pakistan capital markets, where yes, the credit risk is addressed, but what about the long-term aspect of bringing infrastructure bonds? Do you think that it takes time to build up from 5 years to 10 years to a 20-year appetite? Or is this something that can be done in one go, given that the credit risk is really not a problem in this situation?
Yeah, I think doing it in one go is probably a leap too far for investors, even because they also want to manage their liquidity. So, beyond a 5-year time horizon, they will also be taking a view, actually, our liquidity is tied up. Who knows what's going on with interest rates, or who knows what's going on with other investment opportunities. So typically they will want to be at the sort of lower end of the maturity curve. And you have to move them up slowly. Now, if we can develop a capital market where there is secondary liquidity and there are refinancing opportunities, then they are more likely to be able to take longer tenors. And that's really what we want to be able to do. And I mean, going back to one of our projects that we've done in Kenya, we did a green bond for student housing. GuarantCo provided a 50% guarantee for that. And one of the anchor investors was Emerging Africa Infrastructure Funds, one of our sister companies. That project would never have got going, or the bond would not have been fully subscribed without having that anchor investment. Now, following that anchor investment, they did another bond where they didn't need EAIF. EAIF is now getting approached by other investors in the market to buy their holding. So that is going to demonstrate secondary liquidity. If they're able to then sell that, then that gets other investors comfortable, even more comfortable. Actually, look, there is actually trading in this instrument, and we can trade at par. It's not about taking haircuts or whatever the traditional bond pricing model is. Mm-hmm. So I think all those things together can really help push out tenors. We also think, I mean, maybe not so relevant in the bond markets, maybe more in the loan markets, but this liquidity extension guarantee that we are offering is something that really gets people excited, because people are very worried, financial institutions are very worried about ALM, And they should be. I mean, we've just seen what's happened with Silicon Valley Bank, right? And that's a clear, and the contagion that may bring, which is another crisis. Yeah, they seem to have crises on top of crises these days. But that's an ALM, potential ALM failing. So actually, if we take that out of the equation and we say, you manage your asset liability mismatch, but this project actually needs long-term financing. It doesn't need 5-year financing with a big refinancing risk. We will take that risk off your hands. They're much more comfortable taking the credit risk then.
Sure, and honestly, it sounds, when I listen to you, it almost sounds too good to be true, because you are taking a significant risk off investor tables, and you're saying, I have the capacity to absorb it. So I think the question to ask is, how do you absorb that? Because obviously you're working at the margin of what is considered high quality credit. So as guarantees are meant to do, sometimes guarantees get called and sometimes guarantees don't get called. But what has been GuarantCo's track record in paying out guarantees so that the market has comfort that regardless of the fact that I am invested in a long-term instrument, what are the chances when there's a credit event and I cannot get my money back? And I think in Pakistan we've seen that in 2008, where we've seen AA, AAA instruments end up in default situations. How do you, how has your track record been over there, and how have the payouts been to investors in those situations?
Okay, so I mean, you raise a really important point, Maheen, and the proof of the pudding is always in the eating. Okay, you can say this is a guarantee that is available on demand, that it's not like an insurance instrument where you have all these sort of payout protocols, etc., and these operational risks. It's an on-demand instrument. And you can say that, and then it gets called and you don't pay out, then suddenly your whole business falls apart, right? So although we never want a guarantee to be called, in some ways it is good when it is, because it actually demonstrates to the market that we do pay out. Sadly, for my own peace of mind, we've paid out a bit too much in the recent past. We've had a couple of large calls on projects for various reasons, and those haven't always necessarily just been credit events. There have been some engineering issues which you get, operational risks on projects which have meant cost overruns, etc. So we have paid out quite a bit. One thing I would say is, though, that we are patient capital. So though we pay out, we then step into the shoes of the lenders and we play an active role in managing the asset and restructuring the asset. So actually our actual loss and write-off history is relatively low, even though maybe our provisioning has been quite high and our payouts have been quite high. But there are, just to give you a success story, in the very recent past, we paid out and were repaid within the same year, last year, on a guarantee that we had out in Mali, which was a power project where we were actually providing a guarantee for the DSRA. So we paid out, we stepped into the shoes of the lenders, and we were repaid within a matter of months.
Oh, wow. So I think the trick really comes down to the fact that GuarantCo and Pidge companies, they actually like to get into the depth of the project itself. So it's not similar to bank lending. It has overlaps, but the reality is that the way they look at the project cash flows, the way they analyze how the project will come together, that is what gives GuarantCo as well as InfraZamin comfort that the projects are indeed financially viable. And I think in terms of security package, while the ask is similar to the banking sector, there is no requirement to over-collateralize a project, which I think is quite critical, because sometimes that collateral may not just be available. So if we can find ways to work with project viability, commercial feasibilities, I think that's where we have the greatest success in bringing more projects to financial close. So I think we're almost at the end here, Laith, but I'd like to just ask you a final question regarding Pakistan. We are incredibly climate vulnerable. We have seen the damage that the floods have caused us. How do you see Pakistan as a whole going forward in a situation where we don't know whether today it's a flood, tomorrow it could be a drought, third it could be something else? How do countries or emerging markets such as ourselves buffer against these changes that we are seeing? And we are not responsible for them because we are not the carbon emitters. But how do you think that battle can be won, at least locally?
I mean, I really wish I had the answer to that, and greater minds than mine have been, on that topic for some time. And one thing I would say, firstly, I would echo exactly what you're saying. I mean, Pakistan, as Jo, I think, mentioned in her speech earlier, is the 8th most vulnerable country to climate across the whole globe. And if you look at some of the other markets we're in, I mean, Africa as a whole, I think, only emits about 3% of global emissions. And most of that is South Africa, Nigeria, maybe Egypt. Everything else is pretty much negligible. And yet they're the most susceptible to climate change. We've seen the similar floods and cyclones in Mozambique and Malawi as well. And I think we need to really galvanize the international community around this. And when we talk about development and we talk about climate, we shouldn't talk about them separately. We need to talk about them together because they go hand in glove. Climate resilience is development. And I talked about it in a very small way with what's happened with K Electric. And with the monsoon and the illegal connections, and luckily we had 0 deaths last year. That's what we really want. We talk about changing lives. That's our strap line, is pioneering infrastructure, changing lives. But we need to save lives, okay? And that's the lifeblood of the economy. The detriment to a country like Pakistan of the floods is obviously the great tragedy of the loss of human life and the loss of the displacement and the loss of somewhere to live. But actually the impact on the economy knocks on for generations and has those impacts. So we need to stop thinking about development and climate as two separate things and start thinking about them as going hand in glove. And I think when we start doing that, actually, we'll start talking the same language that donors are talking and the same language that impact investors are having. And I think you will see greater capital flows into the country.
Great, thank you. And thank you for a very enlightening session. Any final words of advice for Pakistan, given where we stand today?
Maybe just 2 words, or 3 words. Don't lose hope. I think Pakistan has great potential. We talked, I think it was mentioned that potential can be a sad word, but actually it can be an empowering word as well, because if you know your physics, you know that energy isn't created or it goes away, but it transforms from one thing to another. So let's transform the potential energy into kinetic energy and really get Pakistan moving.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Laith. It was a great session. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Laith, and thank you, Maheen. That was very enriching, and I think it opened a lot of departure points for us to ponder upon and to think about. just to think that development for us for the longest time meant industrialization and technology and going blindfoldedly into what we thought was an established economy, and only to realize that we are a frontline state for climate concerns, and everything now has to be gloved and entwined with sustainability for us to survive through this. We always thought that these are two spectrums, like sustainability or environment on one end and development on the other, but I'm so glad that Leith actually packaged it like this, that the development has to be now climate resilience. That's how we will need to look at climate resilience. And the way GuarantCo is positioned to take the risk off our hands, and all that goodness coming into this conversation was so heartening, and it was so encouraging. I'm sort of looking forward to what I can learn more. We have an upcoming session, a dialogue panel. I'll thank you, Maheen, and thank you, Leith, for being with us on stage. I would like to request Moin Iqbal, Head of Business Origination, InfraZamin, to join us on stage to moderate the upcoming session on developing private sector markets to finance long-term projects. The question is on the private sector and its connection with the public that allows and facilitates growth. Malaysia has one of the highest quality infrastructure amongst the ASEAN countries. In a study by Goldman Sachs Global Economics, Malaysia ranked #1 as one of the highest in quality score at 5.1 compared to South Korea's 5.9, Thailand 4.6, Indonesia 3.8, and the Philippines 3.2. A key factor for the successful implementation of the country's infrastructure projects is the adoption of public-private partnerships. They ironically call it PPP. In the early 1980s, this partnership allowed the government to launch more infrastructure projects by sharing the burden of funding these projects with the private sector. This, in turn, has made the private sector an important engine of national growth. For the upcoming dialogue, I would like to invite Zafar Masood, President and Chief Executive Officer, the Bank of Punjab; Syed Munis Abdullah Alvi, Chief Executive Officer, K Electric. And it was lovely to hear K Electric being mentioned for the success stories that they have. Farooq H. Khan, Chief Executive Officer, Pakistan Stock Exchange; Naz Khan, Principal Country Officer, International Finance Corporation, Pakistan; and Yasir Qadri, Chief Executive Officer, UBL Fund Managers. Now that's what we call a financial and power top line right here on stage. I would want to now hand over to Moin. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Respected guests, esteemed speakers, and distinguished panelists, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for being here. I'd like to welcome you all today for today's panel discussion, Developing Private Market for Financing Long-Term Projects. Pakistan, as a developing country, has significant infrastructure needs, and unfortunately, that's coupled with a significant financing gap as well. Historically, the public sector has played a major role in that domain, but increasingly, for various reasons, budget constraints and others, the private sector needs to raise their hand up and needs to be crowded in. Today, we have a very esteemed panel to discuss the challenges and opportunities that come along with crowding in the private sector, and I hope we will touch upon key aspects as to how we could take this way forward. Thank you. So just in terms of the flow of the conversation, I'll go through with a question each with each panelist. Please try to limit the response to 5 to 7 minutes, followed by a follow-up questions in the same sequence, and hopefully there's enough time for the floor to be opened up to questions as well. So Zafar Saab, based on your vast experience in the banking sector, in your opinion, what's been their role in developing infrastructure in Pakistan, and how do you see it evolving going forward?
Thank you, Moeen. Thank you, InfraZamin, for inviting me to this very important conference. I have a special relationship and bond with Pidge, as Laith mentioned. And it's really good to be here today sharing some thoughts on very difficult question that Moeen has put to me, especially because if I were to be honest, then my community won't be very happy with me. But nevertheless, as you rightly pointed out, in order to explain the whole situation, let me just try and share with you the perspective of the banking industry in Pakistan and a bit of a history. So in 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was absolutely the public sector specialized institutions which did the trick for Pakistan as far as the infrastructure financing was concerned. But since 90s, the equation changed. These specialized institutions, due to lack of governance, evaporated. But at that time, their role was kind of split. The structuring piece, which is the most important piece when it comes to project financing or infrastructure financing, was taken over by these international financial institutions, and particularly the banks were very active then. They actually had a very thriving project financing teams on the ground. And then, of course, they could resort on their international connections as well to get the best examples to replicate. So Citigroup, ANZ Grilles at that time, even the World Bank was involved in HUBCO project, the structuring and all. That was all done. In the road projects, it was ADB, for example. They made a major role in terms of structuring. The funding piece also came from them, but the local funding was catered to by the local commercial banks. Then another wave came through. These